The scientific method, aka scientific inquiry. What does that mean? Well, we looked at yesterday, or what is science? So think about what is science and the branches of science and what it entails and what a good scientist does or has, the qualities they possess. The goal of science is to investigate and understand our natural world, to explain events in the natural world, and to use those explanations to make useful predictions. Science deals, remember, only with the natural world. It cannot deal with things that cannot be tested or surveyed because they can't be verified. Has to be observable. Scientists collect and they organize this information that they're gathering by observing. They're going to do it in a careful way, an orderly way, and they're going to look for patterns, and they're going to look for connections between the events. That's going to be their critical thinking, their analyzing that they're doing. And scientists propose explanations that can be tested by examining evidence and repeated. And scientist is an organized way of using evidence to learn about our natural world. And this process begins with questions, gathering information. Usually, as we said, curious scientists are going to have question why, what, and they're going to think, and they're going to start investigating that. And so this is the process of gathering information about the events or the processes in a careful and orderly way. And it has to begin with observation, or it's not science. So how do they do this? Scientists use a series of procedures or some logical steps that they are going to take, which we call one of two things: the scientific method or scientific inquiry. Same thing. Scientific method or the scientific inquiry is a series of steps, and they're used by scientists to solve a problem or an answer to a question. Remember, in science, problems are questions that come from why, critical thinking, what, when, where. Here's one illustration, and scientific method or scientific inquiry can go in a different order, have fewer steps, longer steps, depends on what book you're looking at. But here's an example of a scientific inquiry or scientific method. First, establish the problem, which in science could have been a question form. Then you will form a hypothesis. Some people form a hypothesis first, and then they establish the problem. See, so it can go in different orders. Then you're going to test that hypothesis, and after you test it through an experiment or a survey, you're going to classify and analyze the data that you collected. And then after you do that analyzing, you're going to choose an answer and make a prediction and then verify it. Establish the problem. This process begins usually with a scientist being curious and asking a question about something that they observe. Like you may notice when you drive home that there's a certain dog that runs out and chases after your bike, or you're riding your bike. You might think, and let's say this is a, let's make it a German Shepherd. So you might think, I wonder how fast German Shepherds can really run. And is this one, a fast one, slow one, or whatever? Well, that would be a question that you come up with, a problem. And then you could actually carry out a scientific inquiry to answer that. Questions come from experiences that you have and from the observations or inferences that you make. But remember, some questions cannot be investigated by science. Doesn't mean you can't investigate them, it's just not in the area of science. Look at these two examples and think which one could be investigated by science and which one could not. Does my dog eat more food than my cat? Which makes a better pet, a cat or a dog? So which investigation, which question there do you think is better, or one that can be answered by the scientific method or scientific inquiry? First one, second one. If you chose the first one, yes, because you could carry out an actual experiment on that. And you could use actually same kind of food if you wanted to. You could measure out the same quantity and put it in each other's dishes, have the dog and the cat separated where they can't get in each other's bowls, and daily you could observe how much is eaten by each one. So that's doable, that's observable. But which pet makes a better pet, that is a value judgment. Therefore, science cannot deal with it. It's limited that way. So we are going to then establish a problem. Remember, a problem in science is going to be one that is answerable by using our scientific method. See, which pet is a better pet is not answerable by using the scientific method or scientific inquiry. The problem has to, first of all, fall within the limitations of science, so you can't pick something that's not observable. You can't make a final answer. You can't make value judgments. You cannot have universal statements. It must be observable, or it's not even under science. It must be measurable, and it must be repeatable. That's how we verify things. So in order to be a good problem, in order to be a well-established problem for science, it has to fall in those categories. Establishing the problem is going to require two things on our part. It's going to require us to do some research, and it's going to require us to limit or define the problem. And I'm going to show you what that means. Okay, background research. You do that by reading books, by talking to qualified people, by searching on the web. You know, we got lots of areas in which we can gain knowledge and to do research about. And let's say we were going to do some kind of experiment on plants and their growth, and does it help to use fertilizer. So you would go then do some research on what is required for plants to grow. You would do research in what is found in these specific types of plant food or fertilizers. Then limiting the problem. Now, limiting the problem says stating the problem carefully. I think it better means that you are able to do it. Take an example. If I said, here's my problem. Does fertilize improve the growth of plants? Now that is a problem. It's stated in a question form. It is answerable by the scientific method. I can perform an experiment to test that, and I could repeat it. But is it doable? Well, you first got to think, how many plants are out there? Is it doable that I test every single plant known to man? No, that's not doable. That's not limited. So I would need to limit that problem to one type of plant, such as a rose. Next, am I going to take a rose, all different kinds of roses? No, you would limit it to one particular type of rose. Then again, look at the fertilizers. How many different kinds of plant food fertilizers? Technically, they're not food. Plants make their own food. They're fertilizers. So what kind of plant food? There's all kinds out there. You're going to test every single available plant fertilizer or food? No, that's not limited. That's not doable. So you want to limit that problem by limiting it to one type of plant and one type of fertilizer, such as Miracle-Gro. Then you're going to form a hypothesis. A hypothesis, a lot of times you heard about it being called an educated guess. It's a possible solution. It's actually a prediction that you're making. And then you're going to test to see if that prediction is correct. So a hypothesis may be true, may not be true. But you're going to make one, such as, yes, Miracle-Gro does affect the growth of a rose. Then we got to test it. We're going to test this hypothesis. And this is going to be either through an experiment or through a survey. Some things lend themselves to experiments. Some things lend themselves to surveys. And when you do these observations either way, it is going to then gather evidence, data. So what about an experiment? Just as I said, with the plants and the Miracle-Gro. You don't carry out a survey to say, does Miracle-Gro affect the growth of tulips or roses, and then pass it out to everybody and have them check yes or no. No, You actually conduct an experiment. Now, if you had, what kind of toothpaste does 7th graders prefer? And you could even narrow that down. Remember, we want to limit it to not just 7th graders, because that would be all over the face of the earth. You could say 7th graders at Elka. You want to narrow it down to a few types. I don't think you would want to use every single toothpaste that's out there. So you might say, what kind of toothpaste, Crest, Colgate, maybe you want another one, Pepsodent, is preferred by 7th graders at Elka? Now, you don't carry out an experiment on the toothpaste or on a person. You actually take a survey and you would pass it out to the 7th graders at Elka and have them check off which they prefer. So that's how we test the hypothesis. And when we test that hypothesis, we are gaining evidence, and we call that evidence, we call it data, or some people say data. And that, what data or data is, it's pieces of information that we have gathered from our observations. It's going to be facts, it's going to be figures, it could be pictures that we're taking, it could be audio that we're taking, but we're all doing it through observations. And of course, remember, we got to be as accurate as possible when we are doing the measuring and then writing down of those pieces of information, that data. Excuse me. Now, let's look at the experiment. The experiment is going to include 3 particular things. It's going to include an experimental variable, an experimental group, and a control group. An example of an experiment that we're going to use to illustrate these things is Miracle-Gro helping the growth of plants. And we got one particular type of plant, not sure what it is. So we would set up 2 groups. One group is what we call the control group. That could be on the right, and then the other group is called our experimental group. Now, when you get these 2 groups, you want everything to be exactly the same except for the Miracle-Gro. You want the same pot, the same kind of dirt, same amount of dirt, same type of plant. You want to put it under the same kind of lighting. You want to give it the same amount and kind of water each day. You want everything to be exactly the same except one of those groups you're going to give Miracle-Gro to and the other not. The one thing that you are testing, in this case Miracle-Gro, that is called the experimental variable. Or in biology they might use the term, and usually will use the term, independent variable. So what an independent variable is, or what an experimental variable, and now think of the word variable. You have variables in math. You're studying pre-algebra. What you learn is a variable. It's something that changes. X might be 1. X might be 0.2. X might be 3/5. It varies. And so an experimental variable is the condition that affects the result of the experiment. You might be testing Miracle-Gro. You might test the type of soil. You might test the type of light. Each one of those would be a variable. And you want to make sure in every experiment that you do, you only have one variable. Something that in the experiment can change. Why do you want one? Think about it. Okay, we go back to these plants, and let's say the one on the left, which has grown better, all right, and we have used different types of soil, and we've applied Miracle-Gro to the one on the left and not to the one on the right. So we have seen increased growth. So how are we going to know what caused that increased growth? Was it the Miracle-Gro or was it the dirt? We don't know because we had two variables. That's why we need one variable. So a variable is a condition that affects the result of the experiment. And only one. Now our experimental group is the group we give that variable to. In our case, the Miracle-Gro. It's the group that can show the effect of the variable. Either they're going to not grow any differently, they'll be the same as the control, or they'll grow more. And how would we test that? By length, by the number of leaves, by color would be better growth, or they might grow worse than the control group. But that's the effect then of the one variable. That's the experimental group. We have to have something to compare the experimental group to. So that's what we call the control group. Every experiment has to have one, a control group. And that is the group that you do not give that independent variable to, that experimental variable to. So we don't give them the Miracle-Gro. And it's this group, this control group, that is going to serve as a comparison. We're going to take our data and compare the growth, compare the number of leaves, compare the height, you could even compare the roots, compare the color, all those kinds of things. Now if we were doing the toothpaste, we would do this with a survey. And what a survey is, it's a set of observations that are made to determine what is common practice in a particular area. Like what is common practice in the toothpaste that is used by 7th graders at ELCA. That's a survey. Now no matter which form we're using, if we're using an experiment to test our hypothesis or we're using a survey, we are going to do two things to the data that we have collected. We're going to first classify it. And a good way that a scientist classifies is by making a table, which you can see on the left, and or by making graphs. And what classify means, you're going to arrange this data so that relationships can be seen. So you have them side by side. It often involves grouping or sorting, like making a chart or a table. And when you have graphs, remember, a picture's worth 1,000 words. So you can see a lot by a graph. And you can say the one in the dark there was the Miracle-Gro, the one in the light was the control. And so you wouldn't even need to know numbers or anything. You could just look at the graph itself and you could see patterns or trends in that particular data. Analyzing is then when you look at those charts and you look at the graphs and you start to determine, does this data support the hypothesis that I had made or not? That's analyzing. And once you analyze it, yes it did, no it didn't, then you're going to choose, yes, Miracle-Gro did improve the growth of roses, or no, Miracle-Gro did not improve the growth of one particular type of rose. And then the scientist doesn't stop there. Remember, To have a good answer, it needs to be verified in science. And so to verify it, do you remember what that is? It's to repeat the experiment or the survey. And the more you repeat it and get the same kind of data that supports the hypothesis that you made and the answer that you chose, it's more likely that your answer is valid. And so that's what a scientist wants to use. They want to use a verified answer. Now let's look at proving versus verify. Proving and verifying are not exactly the same thing. A scientist can never completely prove an answer. Why? Because we are human. Humans make mistakes. No matter how careful we're trying to be, we still make mistakes. Our senses can be fooled. So therefore, we can't prove it, but we can verify it.